So today's service, as I've said before, is on personal boundaries. There are lots of different kinds of personal boundaries. There are physical boundaries, intellectual ones, emotional ones, sexual ones, material boundaries, which have to do with your money and your possessions, and time boundaries. Personally, for me, boundaries is an ongoing piece of work. It will probably be a lifelong piece of work I will be doing. For a long time, I've struggled with assertiveness and setting boundaries. I am a total work in progress on this, so maybe we can all learn something together. One of the main sources on this talk on boundaries is this book. It's called Boundaries: When to Say Yes, When to Say No, to Take Control of Your Life. It's by Dr. Henry Cloud and Dr. John Townsend, and there's a new edition out with a very different looking cover. But what's really interesting about this book is that it's written in a theist Christian context and has a lot of scriptural references and things like that, which isn't very appealing to a lot of you use. The science is sound, the information is sound. These are, psychologists, but if you can't read past some of it, read through, it's better to find another source. But there are tons of boundaries books out there on the market, and there's tons of information on setting boundaries, everything you need to know about boundaries, free online. So the information is definitely out there. But this was the first book that really ever gave me an awareness. And so it's one I've recommended a lot in my life. And a long time ago, I actually recommended the book to a woman I knew who was an adult woman who was having difficulties with her mom. And the problem was that her mom would call her and want to talk about her brother and sister-in-law, how they were living their lives, their life choices, how they did this and that. It turns out the brother and sister-in-law were very normal, responsible adults leading a life of their own. And this young woman was really tiring of hearing of all of this drama from her mother regarding her brother's life. And it was really bothering her. It felt like it might even harm her relationship with her brother. So she decided to set a boundary. She said to her mom next time she went into all of this spinning on the phone about her brother, she said, "Mom, I really am not comfortable with these conversations about my brother. I'm happy to talk to you. I'm not angry with you. But if you continue talking about this subject, I'm going to hang up the phone." So she set a boundary. And the boundary, her mother tested the boundary because she really enjoyed gossiping about her son and daughter-in-law and talking about how she thought they should be living their lives. But every time the young woman would say, "Mom, if you keep up with this topic, we can talk about other things, but if you keep up with this topic, I'm going to hang up the phone." And eventually, this might have been a mistake. She told her mother that she had read a book on boundaries. So in one of these future conversations, she set the boundary. She reminded her mom of the boundary, and her mom said, "I am so over you and your boundaries," right? Her mom got kind of upset, but that kind of showed it was working. Eventually, it calmed down. The mom broke the habit of having to talk about her daughter's brother all the time, and things kind of returned to normal. So this young woman, she made a boundary, she set a boundary, and it worked out pretty well. So when we talk about the definition of boundaries really are guidelines, rules, or limits a person creates to identify for themselves what are reasonable, safe, and permissible ways for other people to behave around them, and how they will respond when someone steps outside those limits. Now that is quite a mouthful. Let me try to shorten that. Boundaries are limits a person makes that determine what are reasonable, safe, and permissible ways for people to behave around them, and then how they will respond when someone goes outside those limits. They say personal boundaries are just like a no trespassing sign. They define where you end, your personal property ends, and the other person's property begins. And they're determined by the amount of physical and emotional space you allow between yourself and others. Personal boundaries help you decide what types of communication, behavior, and interaction are acceptable to you, and of course, which are not. Now, this idea of boundaries can be absolutely earth-shattering for those of us who are raised to be compliant and non-confrontational, never doing or saying anything that will upset someone, and being super accommodating of the needs of others. We're often referred to as people pleasers, right? After all, if someone gets upset with us, it's our fault, right? Because we made them upset, right? And we should feel shame about that, right? No, not at all, right? Boundaries tells us a different story on that. What it really means is that we were never taught how to be assertive and how to set healthy boundaries. Now, the flip side of the people pleaser are those of us who have no sense of others' boundaries at all. They're often described as those people who have no filter or must always have their way, are insensitive to the needs of others, and people who cannot take no for an answer, that no is just not okay for them. Sometimes these folks can be bullies. Sometimes they have trouble controlling their emotions, so they may take their feelings out on others. These folks will go into that no trespassing area and trample all over the lawn, not even realizing they are in unwelcome territory. So why is it important to have boundaries? Why does this matter? Well, they're really important because they help us practice self-care, and they're a practice actually of self-respect. They help us communicate our needs and relationships. They help us make time and space in our lives for positive interactions and minimize the negative ones. They really promote healthy relationships. I mean, setting boundaries is really essential if we want to be emotionally healthy. Unhealthy boundaries can really wear a person down. They can cause emotional pain. They can lead to dependency, codependency. They can lead to depression and anxiety and stress, even physical illness and loss of self-esteem. A lack of boundaries is like leaving the door to your home unlocked so that any unwelcome guest can just come right in at will. But the hard part about boundaries, the part that's hard for me, is that many times we're really reluctant to set them. As I mentioned earlier, that has a lot to do with how we were raised and how we were taught as children on how we should relate to other people. But ultimately, we often fail to set good boundaries because we are afraid of being rejected or abandoned, that the person we're setting the boundary with just may go away. We might be afraid of confrontation, and we feel guilty when another person might get upset with us. So here are some characteristics of unhealthy boundaries. Maybe we all know some people like this or see some of these qualities in ourselves. Someone who shares too much too soon. Or at the other end of the spectrum, someone who is closed off and doesn't express their needs and wants, right? So that one end of the spectrum, the person's boundaries are way too open. And on the other end, they're way too closed. The idea is to be somewhere in the middle. Unhealthy boundaries. Often people with unhealthy boundaries often feel responsible for the happiness of others. You might have an inability to say no for fear of rejection or abandonment. People who can't say no, that's a common thing. You might have a weak sense of your own identity. You base how you feel about yourself on how others feel about you. And you may be disempowered. You allow other people to make decisions for you, and then you feel powerless and can't take responsibility for your own life. So I'm going to tell you a story about, in my life, a time I set a boundary. And I didn't do it right, but I'm going to tell you how I probably should have done it. So early when I was a young adult and a married person, I had a car, my husband had a car. For some reason, I can't remember what reason, my husband had driven my car. And when I went to work the next morning, I realized that he had reprogrammed all of my radio stations. And this made me really angry because this was the car I drove most of the time. He almost never was in the car, let alone driving the car. And I felt like that was really presumptuous to go ahead and just change all the stations. So when I got to work, I picked up the phone and called him at work and said, "Hey, what were you thinking? You reprogrammed all of my radio stations. If you touch my radio again, I am going to break your fingers." Now, I wasn't one to make threats of physical violence very often. I thought, and I had no intention of breaking any fingers, but I felt like this hyperbolic response might make him take it more seriously. That was setting a boundary, but not in the best way possible. So, if I could go back in time, what I should have done was I could have called him after I got into work. It should have gone more like, "Hi, honey, I noticed that you changed my radio stations. This is my car. I drive it most often, and I have the right to choose the settings of the radio, just like you have the right to choose the settings on your radio. Okay? Thank you. Bye-bye." Right? Something like that. That's a better way to set a boundary. One easy phrase to keep in mind when setting a boundary is to say, "This is not okay. X is not okay with me." Right? And a lot of us are taught not to say that. I mean, that's a hard thing for a lot of people to be able to say, but really important if you're going to set a boundary, to be able to say, "No, this is not okay." So, as you can see from my better example of how to handle a boundary, when you determine that a boundary needs to be set, you have to do it clearly, calmly, firmly, respectfully, and in as few words as possible. I mean, you understand the calm part. It's often setting a boundary, you don't do it right away. You wait until you've calmed down and you're not as emotional because you'll do a better job. And the idea of using as few words as possible is that the more words you use, the more you might get yourself into trouble. You might start justifying too much. You might get upset. You might apologize for setting the boundary, which really kind of undermines the boundary in the first place. And the hardest part is dealing with the after effects of setting a boundary, right? You have to realize that you're not responsible for the other person's reaction to the boundary you are setting. You're only responsible for communicating that boundary in a respectful way. If it upsets the recipient of your boundary, you have to realize that it is their problem, not yours. And some people, especially those who are really bad with boundaries, you have to really plan on them not responding very well or very easily. You have to plan on getting a reaction you did not want. You have to expect it, and you have to be prepared to remain firm. Because there are people out there who take advantage of the boundary list. They're accustomed to controlling and abusing and manipulating, and they're going to test you. So you have to be ready for that test and be able to hold firm. People with more normal personality types who just happen to accidentally stumble over a boundary line they didn't know about, they will take boundary setting very well. They will say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that was a line for you. You know, I can respect that." Now, these are the people you need to be hanging out with, right? They're the ones that you need to have more of in your life, and less of the others who would react negatively to setting a boundary. You know, when we do set boundaries, sometimes we feel like we've been selfish and we feel guilty or we feel embarrassed, because it is a little confrontational. But it really is a form of self-care. And it does really prevent us from being used and abused and disrespected. And all of these things, like if they're allowed to continue, they undermine our self-esteem and our well-being and our mental health, honestly. But fortunately, setting boundaries is a learned skill and it gets easier with practice. So you might be wondering when it's time to set a boundary, when you might need to set a boundary. It's usually time to set a boundary when you are feeling angry or resentful, or you find yourself complaining about the same thing over and over, or maybe just that feeling that something is wrong, like the pit of your stomach. There's something in the pit, a rock in the pit of your stomach. You might feel as though you're being dragged down. All of those instances, you might actually need to set a boundary with someone or even with yourself. It's important that this time that you listen to yourself and really take some time to think about what you need to do or say, and then at the right time, actually communicate in an assertive way about what your boundary is. And working on boundaries is easier if you are surrounded by people who understand boundaries and are willing to adhere and respect them, because those are the people that are going to be able to support you in times that you have to set boundaries. And what's really interesting about hanging out and being around people who have good boundaries and respect boundaries, that will help you identify the toxic people in your life, those who want to manipulate, abuse, and control you. You will see the difference, and your shift potentially of what is normal and what is okay will be more prominent and change. Now, boundaries aren't just important to individuals, they're important in organizations. The Erica Hewitt reading implied that. You know, any place where people have to gather and coexist or share a common mission or get along needs some boundaries, and that includes congregations. I'm going to actually share a quote from a blog post by Dr. Henry Cloud, one of the writers of the Boundaries book, on boundaries in church. And I've also adapted it to take out some more of the overt Christian theist language. He says, surprisingly, that church is not a perfectly safe place. That sounds like it cannot be true. For if anywhere should be safe, the church should be safe. Every fiber in our being rejects the idea that one place we think ought be safe isn't. Anyone who has been in the church for a very long time has been hurt by people in the church. Here we find some harsh realities: judgment, pride, self-centeredness, manipulation, abandonment, abuse, control, perfectionism, domination, and every kind of relational sin, yes, he said sin, known to humankind. The walls of the church do not make it safe from that. In fact, church by definition is composed of flawed human beings. To further complicate matters, church by its very nature activates our most primitive and dependent longings because we want a perfect family. We often see the church as our second family, and often we take into the church the same longing for security and love that we take into our families of origin. And for some, as in their original family, the wish is not only disappointed, it can be crushed altogether. What are we to do with that reality? Now that's the end quote. But my answer to his question, what to do with that reality, that's where boundaries come in. That's why we need to practice good boundaries at church. Knowing that we are all flawed individuals, knowing that we all have the potential to hurt others. Healthy boundaries in church can help protect people, and they honestly help protect the whole. So, what do good boundaries in church look like? Well, first, a congregation that has as many people as possible with healthy boundaries helps a lot, right? A church full of people with healthy boundaries will most likely have healthier boundaries itself. Having leaders who practice healthy boundaries helps. Another way we work right now to ensure healthy boundaries in our church is through our covenant of positive relations. That, I've just read a chunk of it before the service today. If anything, this document gives lots of examples of how to hold healthy boundaries, from speak words that promote positive relationships, even in times of conflict, to engaging from a place of sincerity and striving to be our best selves, to accepting responsibilities for our actions. That is a very boundary affirming statement right there. So just about every single line in our covenant of positive relations can be interpreted as actions that promote healthy boundaries, and thus positive relations, the title of the document. Our covenant provides this mutual understanding and mutual accountability that allows us to be together in a healthy way and maintain a community of equals, which is one of our key principles. And I took a look at our 7 UU principles through the lens of boundaries. Our principles are value statements, and they're also covenantal statements. but in many ways, they can also be interpreted as boundaries that allow us to be together. There are boundaries that promote healthier people and communities and a healthier world overall. So I'm going to read the principles through briefly. And as I read them, I invite you to think about how these principles are boundaries. And I think the easiest way is to think of what would happen if you did the opposite of what the principle said, right? The first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. 2, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. 3, acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. 4, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. 5, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process with our congregations and in society at large. 6, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. 7, respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. And I don't think we can accomplish any of those 7 principles without a sense of boundaries. So there's a researcher out there, I've mentioned her before, named Brené Brown. She is a sociology professor out of Houston, but she's also kind of become a pop culture self-help icon, but her pop culture self-help is science-based. She actually has done some research on boundaries, although that was not her original content. She was actually doing research on compassion. So she was trying to find the commonalities found between extremely compassionate people. So she started out with people who are in professions that seem to be compassionate, like clergy, other helping professions. And they interviewed a lot of people, and they drilled down to that most compassionate of that compassionate group and singled that group out and continued to interview them more extensively. These were the most compassionate people who really lived it every day. They were people who saw the humanity in everyone and believed in oneness in all. So this central group of people was extensively interviewed, and they started to find similarities among people in the group. The common thread among the extremely compassionate people surprised Brené Brown. She went into it thinking that the common thread among the really compassionate people would be spiritual beliefs. She was wrong. The common thread among the compassionate people was that they had what she called boundaries of steel. So she was still shocked by her findings. So she went back to her subject group and just checked in with them to see if this finding made sense to them. So she asked them, what they thought about the idea that they were people with boundaries of steel. And this is what she heard in response. Things like, I would not have said it that way, that I have boundaries of steel, but yeah, I'm very clear about what's okay and what's not okay. I don't subject myself to the abuse of other people. So in Brené Brown's words, she says, boundaries are finding a way to be generous towards others while continuing to stay in your integrity. Boundaries allow you to stay in your personal integrity. It's staying true to yourself and grounded while also feeling compassion towards others. So this was really interesting, I thought. And I'm wondering, maybe it is the strong boundaries that actually make room to be compassionate, or make being compassionate a sustainable thing. Freeing people from compassion fatigue and burnout by, wasting themselves away in service of others, kind of behaving in the way that the tree did not, right? In self-sacrificing ways. And this, I think, above all, really reinforces the idea that by setting boundaries, you're not a bad person. You're not an uncaring person. You're not a mean person. You are not without compassion if you set a boundaries. Setting boundaries may actually improve your ability to be compassionate toward others. Setting boundaries may actually strengthen your internal reserves so that you have more kindness to give to others. So today I invite you all to think about boundaries in your life. Do you need to set a boundary or two or three? How would you go about stating your boundary? You might want to write it down and practice it. And then at the right time, you might try setting it with another person. Or instead, if you think you might be a person who is prone to overstepping others' unspoken boundaries, you might want to think about how you could change that. Maybe by asking questions like, how do you feel if I? Or do you mind if I? Or is it okay if I share this right now with you? Or is now a good time? Or do you mind if I change the channel? But only ask those questions if you're willing to hear no, and accept the no when you hear it. Accepting boundaries set by others, fair boundaries set by others, is some really serious high-level adulting. So I'm going to close today with some words from the meditation reading by Erica Hewitt. She said, "The accountability required by setting a boundary isn't inherently unkind. If anything, it's an expression of care for everyone else in the picture, because a system, a people, a community is only as healthy as the boundaries it agrees to keep." May it be so. Blessed be and amen.